Hi everyone, today we're talking about Wilhelm Wundt, the man who turned psychology into a science. We'll start with his life story, then look at his structuralism theory, creative synthesis idea, research methods, how he built psychology's experimental tradition, his importance to psychology, his influence on later thinkers, and the criticisms of his work. Let's dive into the world of this father of modern psychology. First, Wundt's life. He was born in 1832 in Baden, Germany. He studied medicine first and got a doctorate, then moved to the overlap of physiology and philosophy. He even worked as an assistant to Hermann von Helmholtz, a famous physicist. This taught him to use experimental measurements to study the mind. In 1879, he set up the world's first experimental psychology lab at the University of Leipzig. This is widely seen as the start of scientific psychology. He also wrote Principles of Physiological Psychology and launched Philosophical Studies, the first academic journal for psychology. These achievements made him the clear father of modern psychology. Before Wundt, psychology wasn't an independent subject, it was just part of philosophy. Early studies were just philosophical debates. Plato argued if the soul was born with us or shaped by experience. Descartes talked about mind-body dualism, but none of this had real proof. Then, in the 1800s, physiologists made big steps. Helmholtz measured how fast nerve signals travel. Fechner created Fechner's law, linking physical stimulus to how we feel it. This was the first time anyone showed inner experiences could be measured objectively. Wundt knew both physiology and philosophy. He saw the chance. If perception could tie to physical reactions, we could use lab tools to study more complex mental things. Suddenly, psychology moved from philosophical talk to a science we can test with experiments. This was psychology's declaration of independence. Wundt's main goal was to turn psychology from studying the abstract soul into a science of human conscious experience. His task wasn't just to say what consciousness is, it was to analyze its structure and how it works. Between 1873 to 1874, he published Principles of Physiological Psychology. In 1879, he opened the Leipzig Lab. In 1883, he started Philosophical Studies. By 1885, psychology classes were separate from philosophy. These steps gave psychology the three pillars of a natural science: testable hypotheses, repeatable experiments, and measurable data. Psychology wasn't a little brother to philosophy anymore, it was its own scientific subject. Wundt's theory for this new subject was structuralism. Think of it as the atomic theory of consciousness. He believed complex human consciousness could be broken into two basic mental elements. Wundt said these elements are the smallest pieces of consciousness, like atoms in chemistry. You can't split them into simpler parts. That's structuralism's core idea. How do these atoms become complex consciousness? Wundt gave two ways. Passive association. Elements combine naturally if they're close in time or space. For example, if you ring a bell every time you feed a dog, bell and food will link. Later, the bell alone makes the dog salivate. This is similar to Pavlov's conditioning, which came after Wundt. Active apperception. This was Wundt's key idea. Our mind doesn't just receive elements. It actively chooses and organizes them into meaningful whole. This active combining of elements into a whole is what Wundt called creative synthesis. He thought consciousness isn't a passive mirror, it's a dynamic process. We turn simple sensations, feelings, into new, meaningful ideas. A simple example: when you see an apple, you don't first notice red, then round, then sweet, and then add them up. Your mind immediately synthesizes these elements into the full, meaningful idea of apple. That's the power of creative synthesis. How did Wundt study these elements in synthesis? He created experimental introspection, his key method. First off, the controlled setting. Experiments were in labs, using tools like reaction timers to control free samples, things like light duration or sound volume. Next, the narrow focus. He only studied simple, quick experiences, like sensations or short feelings, not complex thoughts or memories, since those were too subjective. Then, the standard descriptions: Participants were trained to talk objectively. Instead of saying, "I see red," they'd say, "I feel a warm, bright visual sensation." Last, the repeatable results. The same experiment worked with different people at different times, so results could be compared. Before him, introspection was just thinking about your own thoughts. But Wundt made it a controlled scientific method. This turned introspection from personal views into a scientific tool. For the first time, psychology was measurable, repeatable, and observable, true to science standards. The Leipzig lab wasn't just a room, it built the foundation of modern psychology. First, it made psychology fully independent. Once experimental introspection plus tool measurement gave psychology its own research method. He set steps to repeat results. Later schools followed this: Titchener, stricter introspection; Watson, behaviorist experiments. Even today's labs use controlled experiments. Second, it gave a theoretical framework. Before 1879, psychology only used philosophy for consciousness. Wundt's lab brought controlled experiments, for example, reaction timers to measure sensation speed, weight tools for sensation differences. This made psychology study the mind scientifically, separate from philosophy. Third, it built experimental tradition. Wundt proved consciousness is a scientific subject, not magic. He split it into sensations and feelings and tested them. This broke the unmeasurable consciousness idea and helped later attention, perception studies. Wundt's influence spread globally via his students. Each became their country's psychology founder. G. Stanley Hall, USA, his first American student, set up America's first psychology lab, started the American Journal of Psychology, and became father of American developmental psychology. Edward Titchener, UK, brought structuralism to the USA, tightened introspection, and led the structuralist school. Lightner Whitmer, USA, father of clinical psychology, first used psychology to treat mental issues and opened the world's first psychology clinic. Hugo Munsterberg, Germany, father of industrial psychology, first applied psychology to workplaces, for example, work environment versus productivity. Yujiro Motora, Japan, father of Japanese psychology, brought experimental psychology to Japan, built its first lab, and started its first psychology journal. These students were like seeds. They took Wundt's ideas worldwide, making psychology a global subject. Of course, Wundt's ideas faced criticism later. For example, Watson said experimental introspection is too subjective. Even with training, "I feel a warm sensation" is still a personal description, not fully objective. Later cognitive psychologists also thought structuralism only splits elements, not focusing on the mind's whole function. But we can't deny this. Wundt was the first to take the mind from philosophical talk and give it the scientific bones of experiments, measurement, and data. When he turned on the light in his Leipzig lab, psychology became a science, one that uses experiments and evidence. Finally, let's talk about the limits of Wundt's structuralism. First, it's not broad enough. His research only looked at European adults. He didn't think about how people from different cultures, ages, or genders might have different mental experiences. Second, it's too subjective. His trained introspection method relied too much on people describing their own inner feelings. So the results weren't always fully fair or unbiased. Third, he missed too much. He ignored things like unconscious thoughts, people's actual behaviors, and complex thinking like problem-solving or creativity. So that's Wilhelm Wundt, the man who turned psychology from philosophical talk into a proper science. From his lab in Leipzig to the global spread of his ideas, he laid the groundwork for modern psychology, even if his work had its limits. Thanks for watching.